Yes, I'm finally making a response to Xexizy. Now, I've been thinking about making a reply to his "the Soviet Union was capitalist" rubbish for months, but decided against it until now. What was the last straw? His debate with Jason Unruh, where he made statements like this.
Essentially, I would say it still had a capitalist mode of production, even though it was, still different to, say, liberal democracies. Not the mode of production itself, but the general society.
That's right, folks, the USSR had the same mode of production as the US. What a load of half-baked drivel. Now, of course, Xexizy's argument is that the USSR retained a capitalist mode of production, which, in his view, includes commodity production, profit, value, capital, and money. Now, if you have read the works of Marx and Engels, you would know they go into great detail about how commodity production, wage labour, value, capital, and money work in a capitalist system. Now, if you compare the Soviet planned economy with the capitalist mode of production as described by Marx and Engels, you will find that Xexizy has no idea what he is talking about. Anyway, let's begin.
So first off, I'll say that, not all aspects of production in the USSR economy did turn into commodities, but we see the same thing happen in capitalist countries as well, actually. So for instance, in European social democracies, they have free healthcare and things like that, and welfare and all that stuff. So they have a lot of production that doesn't become the commodity form, but this doesn't mean that they're some kind of halfway
That's a non
between
sequitur.
socialism and, sorry, let me finish my argument. That doesn't mean there's the same logic doesn't apply there. That then there's some kind of halfway between socialism and capitalism, or socialism altogether.
We will ignore Xexizy's ignorance on how a capitalist welfare state works for now and go straight to his comment on commodity production. So by admitting that the USSR did not have generalized commodity production, Xexizy has destroyed his argument. Why? Because for an economic system to be capitalist, commodity production must be the typical form of production, generalized across society. One of the key elements of this is the labourer selling his labour power to the capitalist as a commodity, as Marx states in Capital Volume 1. The result becomes inevitable from the moment there is a free sale by the labourer himself of labour power as a commodity, but it is also only from then onwards that commodity production is generalized and becomes the typical form of production. It is only from then onwards that, from the first, every product is produced for sale and all wealth produced goes through the sphere of circulation. Now, was this the case in the USSR? Was every product produced for sale and all wealth produced go through a sphere of circulation? No, and Xexizy admits to this himself. Land, medicine, labour power, housing, etc. in the USSR were not commodities. In fact, most things produced for use were allocated according to a plan. It should also be noted that the means of production could not be sold or bought. So, Xexizy's argument that the USSR retained a capitalist mode of production is simply idiotic. In fact, at times I think he has no idea what he is talking about. For example,
it's best that before we get further into things, we define two commonly used terms in the theory: commodities and capital. A commodity is simply a good that is produced specifically to be exchanged for a profit. Capitalism as a mode of production is this kind of production, commodity production, generalized and perpetuated to the whole of society.
Yes, generalized commodity production is a key characteristic of the capitalist mode of production. So Xexizy's own law of value video contradicts what he has been saying about the USSR. It's as if he didn't really understand what he was talking about in that video.
When I make my speeches, I am desperately praying that there's somebody who'll tell me what on earth it is I'm saying. My particularly rapid, unintelligible pattern isn't generally heard, and if it is, it doesn't matter.
So first off, I'll say that, not all aspects of production in the USSR economy did turn into commodities, but we see the same thing happen in capitalist countries as well, actually. So for instance, in European social democracies, they have free healthcare and things like that, and welfare and all that stuff. So they have a lot of production that doesn't become the commodity form, but this doesn't mean that they're some kind of halfway
That's a non
between
sequitur.
socialism and sorry, let me finish my argument. That doesn't mean there's the same logic doesn't apply there. That then there's some kind of halfway between socialism and capitalism, or socialism altogether.
Here, Xexizy is confusing distribution with production. He also shows that he has no idea how a universal healthcare system works in a capitalist country. The British NHS has to purchase medicine from private pharmaceutical companies and then distributes medicine or health treatment accordingly. Of course, the market determines the prices of these medicines. The state just covers the bill. So, there is still commodity exchange between the NHS and the private pharmaceutical companies. In the USSR, healthcare and medicine was allocated according to a plan. This is what Xexizy fails to understand. Britain has a market-based economy. The USSR had a planned socialist economy. There is a massive difference.
Secondly, you also say that it wasn't always done with the profit motive, and the law of value wasn't dominant and things like that. But I think that's just another way of saying there was no competition. And obviously, I'll concede that because there were no markets, so there obviously was no competition.
In my view, Xexizy clearly lost the debate here. Still, let's continue.
But I don't think that means then that it's really at the core of it that different, because you're still making profits. I mean, it's kind of like, if a co-op, for instance, when they don't lay off their workers when they could, in favor of automation, they're not running their business according to the law of value. But then this isn't socialism in any way, because they're still producing commodities for a profit, even if they're not getting the most profit they possibly could out of. It's like companies that don't engage in planned obsolescence because they want a higher build standard and things like that.
In a capitalist country, companies and co-ops that refuse to follow the law of value go bankrupt. That is what happens when they stop caring about profits. The USSR, by contrast, did not produce for profit, which was one of the reasons why the country was able to industrialize so quickly. Pretty simple. I find it sad that the greatest Marxist since Karl Marx himself doesn't even know how capitalism works.
Exceptions like, oh, well, they produce commodities, but they did it in this particular way and things like that. But I think that's all kind of redundant when you realize that the very fact that commodities exist at all shows that there must be a distinction between private and social labor in society, because the reason that commodities, the reason that goods take on the form of commodities and take on value to relate to society is because they need a way to pass from private into social labor. And they do so by taking on value. That's how they become social. That's why they become commodities. But under socialism, labor must be directly social from the outset. Therefore, goods no longer have to take on the form of value to relate to society because they're already managed by society.
See, Xexizy is desperately clinging to the fact that there was still small-scale commodity production in the USSR. Every time he is reminded that it was not the typical form of production, he uses the moronic co-op example. However, the fact remains that the USSR still retained commodity production in some areas, such as in the realm of consumer goods, which were still produced as commodities. Furthermore, the USSR had two types of ownership: state ownership that overwhelmingly dominated the economy, and some co-op ownership located in towns. Even though these co-ops were bound to the social plan, it is true that not all industries in the USSR were commonly owned by the people. These co-ops still existed. It is still clear to anyone with half a brain that the USSR did not have a capitalist mode of production. It was, as the Leninists argue, a socialist society that was still stamped with the birthmarks of the old capitalist society. It was clearly on its way towards communism, though. There was no capitalist class. Generalized commodity production had been replaced with production for use. The capitalist market had been replaced with a social plan, and most property was in common ownership. Before I go, I must make this clear. I do not think the USSR was a perfect society. For example, I would have liked to have seen the social plans of the USSR being based more on democratic decision. However, I also understand that the USSR was constantly under threat from outside forces, which created a siege mentality in that country. Still, I have grown tired of hearing Xexizy's idiotic commodity production argument being repeated to me on a daily basis. I honestly wonder if Xexizy thinks ancient Rome and other ancient civilizations were capitalists. After all, they had commodity production. It wasn't generalized, but that doesn't matter to Xexizy and his vile lackeys on Twitter. I also like to remind those fools that this is my first video on Xexizy's bullshit ever. It's not the 50th, it's the first. Furthermore, I have the right to praise or criticize someone as much as I like. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it.